Welcome to Let's Chat with Derick. I am your host, Derick Phage, and pleased to introduce to you today's guest. He wears a few hats. He is a writer, he is a health tech entrepreneur, and now a host of a brand new original CBC series called Good People. I'm joined by Mark Sakamoto. Welcome to the show, Mark. Great to have you.
Hey, thanks a lot, Derick. Really appreciate the time and appreciate chatting with you.
I don't think there can be a better time than to have a series like this, Mark, with the pandemic and so forth. But before we get to that, I just wanted to ask you on a personal level, how have you been dealing with the situation?
Well, thank you very much. My wife and my two daughters have been hunkered down in Toronto for the duration of this, and we're managing as best we can. We're lucky in the sense that we're safe and I'm continuing to work and so by and large we're in good shape. Thank you for asking. I appreciate that.
Oh, you're welcome. And you mentioned you've continued to work. I imagine as well, though, that it has had an impact on your, because I mean you wear many hats. So maybe you could tell me a little bit about the impact it's had on you professionally.
Well, in a strange way, as the world has sort of hit the pause button, my day job has maybe never been busier.
Really?
At Think Research, it's a digital health company that I help run. We're about 200 people, and mostly in Toronto, but we have clients around the world. Certainly deep within the Canadian healthcare spectrum. So what we do is we provide digital protocols and communication tools like virtual care to clinicians. And so what we've seen, Derick, in the last 10 weeks in terms of innovation within the healthcare sector, probably otherwise would have taken maybe 10 years.
Really?
In terms of really laying down the foundation for virtual care into long-term care homes or oncology clinics, wherever, as the healthcare system has really emptied out the hospitals to prepare for an influx of COVID-19 patients. Clinicians still needed to see their patients. Somebody who has cancer still has cancer. Somebody who has diabetes still has diabetes, or mental health, certainly. So we really, as a system, really needed to quickly find new ways to communicate, and so we were positioned to assist, and so we're really leaning in.
Let's talk about your series, Good People. Tell me a little bit about the series and how it came to be, Mark.
Sure. After you mentioned that I had written a book, it was published in 2014, and it had this real resurgence in 2018. It won CBC Canada Reads. And so when you win Canada Reads, you sort of go on this press junket, and
Right.
Jeannie Becker and I did a lot of national media. And a couple months after, CBC executives called me and said, "Hey, we'd like to continue working with you, and what would you like to do?" And I said, "Well, got a pretty busy day job." But they were really accommodating, and they worked around it. But it did make me sort of stop and think. I mean, if I had this opportunity to have a large platform, what would my voice sound like?
Right.
And so what I really wanted to do was sort of counterbalance the internet troll and the constant stream of bad news.
Yeah.
This was all obviously pre-pandemic, but really, in a way that was, offering hope and actual solutions, but not blind hope. Like, hey guys, there are, the opioid crisis as an example. Huge problem, and the numbers are so terrible. And you drive downtown Vancouver or small town Ontario, and you see the effects, and you sort of sometimes you can just shrug your shoulders and say, "Well, this problem is just going to haunt us forever," and it's not the case. It doesn't have to be that way. And so while Good People wasn't produced during the time of COVID, it sort of is produced for the time of COVID, in the sense that, we've all hit the pause button, and in the quiet of these nights and days, we can ask ourselves, if there is a silver lining, it must be, what do we want to emerge into? What do we want our city, our nation, our world to look like? And so I think that there is I hope that this is an offering of that kind of rational hope.
Yeah, no, I agree, Mark, because I think around a lot of people's dinner tables, that's a conversation that people are having. Okay. This is a terrible situation, but we have an opportunity to maybe do a reset, to maybe have, sort of a new world, and what would we want out of that? And it's something that's, fascinated me is, we live in a great area where, we live by the river. So, we can practice social distancing quite easy when we take our dogs out for a walk. And what's been incredibly refreshing is how people are sort of asking each other how they're doing. And it's not something that I'd seen before. I have seen my neighbors more than I've ever seen them before, and certainly practicing social distance, but everyone's asking, how are you doing? Hey, great to see that you're outside today. How's you and your family? I hope we stick to that. And I hope we also stick to, having an appreciation for the outdoors and for nature. Before this, we're all on our screens, and then the pandemic hits, and we all want to be outside, right? I mean, the irony of it is incredible, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think that the earnest, how are you doing? 2 months ago, 3 months ago, how you doing? How's it going? Blah, blah, blah. And then just get to the point, get to the conversation. The point of the conversation now really is, how are you doing? How are you faring, neighbor? I think that what COVID-19 has laid bare is that we are only as strong and vibrant as the most vulnerable amongst us. And so really connecting to and with and supporting those that are the most vulnerable has become top of mind. In all of these episodes that we look at, whether it's homelessness or gun violence or opioid crisis, the problem, the problem can hit anybody, but it does hit those that are most vulnerable to begin with anyway.
Yeah.
And so I think that coming out of, COVID-19, I think that is a real genuine consensus that is sort of bubbled to the top. And so I think you're right, Derick. I do hope that we take that same sort of sentimentality or intent and apply it on the other end of this.
Yeah, very well said, Mark. I couldn't agree more. Well, let's talk about episode number 1. I've had a chance to see the episode, and I was really moved by it. Of course, I was shocked by some of the numbers as well. I think it's 235,000 people in Canada homeless, and it just, in a country like ours, that kind of number, it just doesn't seem possible. But I mean, that's the truth that we live in. So let's talk about episode number 1, because I know it's very personal to you as well, Mark.
Yeah, sure. So I think you're right, Derick. The numbers, we are a very wealthy nation by international standards. So to have 200,000 plus of our fellow neighbors living on the street or living in rough is a number that seems unconscionable. On the other hand, it's a number that is so big that how do you wrap your mind around it? So what we really tried to do is, obviously we try to provide the numbers because they are kind of a slap in the face. But when you get a number that big, you sort of, again, well, gee, that seems, I don't know what I could do with that. So we really tried to take a human face to it. So and tell the human toil. And so we started in tent cities in Hamilton.
Yeah.
The top of the mountain in Hamilton, there's really expensive houses. And then there's this beautiful treed hills. Within those treed hills live encampments that look like the apocalypse. Shanty lean-tos, burning, barrels to keep warm, filled with wood and whatever folks can gather. I'd never been in any environment like that, Derick. I was kind of scared to go in. I was scared to go in.
Mm-hmm.
The smells, the sounds were horrific. And what I was especially not prepared for was seeing like 13-year-olds living in that environment. I was kind of waiting for, I sort of had thought like 28-year-old men was sort of like the thing I had in my mind. No, 13-year-old girls, 65-year-old women. Shocking. So shocking that I did think, gee, we've sort of, the intent of the show is to show solutions, and I just don't think there's a solution. After the first few days of shooting, I was like, we're never going to get past the pilot because we're never going to get to a solution for this.
Yeah, I remember one young man in the episode actually said to you, "Oh, I guess you weren't expecting this, were you?"
Exactly. You weren't
Right?
expecting this. I think he just saw my face. Honestly, I think he just saw the look in my eyes. And then fast forward, we go to my hometown of Medicine Hat. Medicine Hat is, by a country mile, the most conservative part of our country. Like, it is a very sort of settler prairie town. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. That kind of sentiment really is at the forefront of Medicine Hat, and that's good and bad. I mean, I'm not, not casting any judgments. That's just what it is. And so, but it's certainly, Medicine Hat is certainly not a place where you'd think about implementing radical social housing policy. You just wouldn't. The mayor, Ted Clugston, ran an election against housing first, against the policy. He was like, no, go get a job. I have 2 jobs. You don't need marble countertops. All these kinds of zingers. And then he won. And he looked at the numbers, and it cost the city about $100,000 a year to have somebody on the street or living
per person, right?
Per person, $100,000 per person in a whole series of uses of social and taxpayer dollars. The police, clinics, social work, on and on, the criminal justice system, on and on and on. Whereas it costs about $58,000 to house somebody. So for Ted, the mayor, he flip-flopped, which was great to see. You hardly ever see that. Not because he had sort of an emotional change of heart. He just saw the numbers. He was convinced by the numbers. And from my perspective, what was interesting is doing the more compassionate thing was also the cheapest thing.
Yeah.
And so for me, coming out of that, I didn't really care whether I was agnostic to the fact of whether it was the economics or compassion. At the end of the day, Medicine Hat housed every single homeless person in the city. There are 0 people that need a home in Medicine. Functional 0. Amazing. And then you get to meet somebody, and then we put a face to it to sort of round out your question. We put a face to it. So we met a whole host of people, but the guy that sticks out in my mind is a guy named Corey. Corey'd been drinking a 40 of vodka every day since he was 15. He was about 23, 24 at the time. He'd been homeless his entire adult life, Derick. He'd never had a roof over his head as an adult. And he got brought into the program, the Housing First program. I sat in his 2-bedroom apartment in Medicine Hat that looked like my apartment when I was going to school, university. It wasn't luxurious, but it was nice. And
it was a decent place. Yeah.
And what was the effect? The effect was Corey now woke up every day feeling filled with dignity, with a smile, ready to take on the day. Hadn't had a drop of booze. That's not part of the program. He didn't need to be sober, but he hadn't had a drop of booze in 6 months, and he wanted to contribute. So if you get 4,500 Corys in a town like Medicine Hat of 65,000 people, that has a huge effect.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it changed, it changed the way I think most folks in at least in Medicine Hat thought about this issue. So what a great thing. Like my one of my favorite lines is from Leonard Cohen. He said, "There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in." And Medicine Hat just found that crack and jammed light in it. And it was you mentioned that it's a personal story as well. Going home I love my hometown. It's also a very it's hard for me to go home.
Yeah, you didn't want to go back, did you?
I didn't. Well, there were parts of it that I didn't want to go. This problem has touched me as well. My mother was a great mom when I was growing up, but she was an alcoholic, and she went to my daughter's bringing me breakfast.
That's okay.
um, she went to a very dark place. She lost everything. She lost her two boys, and ultimately she lost her life. And I just, I couldn't help but think, gee, if this policy had taken hold in Medicine Hat 15 years earlier, I wonder if my mom would, see her granddaughter, Mia, who just dropped off my breakfast. Those sorts of thoughts are heartbreaking, and so it was a really tough. It was a very tough show for me to produce.
Yeah, I can imagine, Mark. And I think something that stood out to me is near the beginning of the film, you say, like, when it comes to policy, it dated back to the Paul Martin days. And maybe you could just explain that briefly of what happened with the policy that he implemented.
Yeah, sure. So, Canada had built over the years, sort of throughout the first Trudeau and the Mulroney years, social housing had pretty significant budgets. So municipalities could, buy lands and construct or buy, refurbish apartments and these sorts of policies. And, in the 90s, early 90s, under Chrétien and Martin as the finance minister, Canada did have a massive debt. Like I kind of do, I don't want to point the finger in a way that's sort of gotcha politics. That's not right. The point of this, but Canada really we had a structural deficit. We were really, our credit rating was a significant risk. And if your credit rating goes down, then your interest goes up, and then you're paying more money. You can get into this terrible downward economic cycle, and Canada was close to it. So they had to make some very hard decisions, and one of the things that was really on the chopping block was social housing. It's an easy number to sort of cut, because then you're just like, okay, there's no more real estate being, like, all of these sorts of heavy infrastructure. You can get in quick cuts, you can get a lot of zeros. Yeah. And when you're the finance minister looking for money, you're looking for a lot of zeros. And that was one of them. And it had a profound impact on social policy in Canada, because, once you lose your home, that's your safe place. Yeah. And then you're vulnerable to so many other things downstream: mental health, obviously economic, mental health, physical health. You're out on the street, so you're vulnerable to everything, whether that be a virus or whether that be some other, humans who are out to harm or take advantage and exploit. So while on the one hand we got out of that economic crisis, the unintended consequence of that spurred a lot of personal crises.
And not realizing not only the personal costs but the economic costs, because as you've shared, the solution is actually cheaper, right?
Correct. Exactly. It can kind of feel like a bit of a shell game. Well, we save money here, but now you're spending money over here. It just takes longer for that money to sort of come back on. It takes a while for that person to sort of become that, a real cost center, because he or she is completely homeless. You're sort of deferring the costs a little bit, but they always, sure as heck, they come back.
Mark, what do you hope people take away from the series overall?
Yeah. What I hope is, I hope that they come away with it thinking that there are actual scalable solutions to almost every seemingly insurmountable problem. And this is not a blind faith kind of show. we really looked at places, whether it be Vermont, in Burlington, Vermont, that has really sort of gone from the worst place for opioid crisis to the best place. Gun violence, where cure violence programs out of the south end of Chicago have dramatically reduced gun violence in one of the roughest neighborhoods in America. My hometown of Medicine Hat, solving homelessness. These are, coming out of COVID-19, all of these problems are only exacerbated by COVID-19, but they still exist. And we have more on top of it now because of the health and obviously the economic crisis that comes out of the health crisis. But there are also solutions. And they're real solutions. They exist at scale. They're not a unicorn. And so I hope that we can sort of rally around those solutions.
Yeah, I think we will, Mark, because I think we've seen, the general public rally around this pandemic, and I think that makes a huge difference, because when we're thinking it every day, when it's heartfelt and there's an understanding that, hey, you know what, we're all going through it. Unlike some of these topics that you've discussed, people don't necessarily relate to it. Although I think when they watch it, and I can say this from personal experience watching the first episode, they will relate, because they will have a face and a voice to a really important issue that, they probably just turned away from, because, as you said, the numbers are so staggering, it seems insurmountable. Mark, where can people watch the entire series?
Yeah, sure. So it's launching on CBC Gem, their streaming player. So you catch it there. It launches. The first episode starts May 8th, this Friday. I hope you check it out. I hope it touches you in some way.
No, I appreciate your time, Mark. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to chat.
Yeah, be safe, you and your family. All the best to you.
Likewise. Thank you.
Take care.